Welcome back to Strictly Money. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland has selected OBSI, the Ombudsman for Banking Services and Investments, as the single external complaints body to investigate and resolve complaints between Canadian banks and consumers. Now, if you're wondering why this matters, stay put. To talk about the significance of this is Jean-Paul Bureau, Executive Director at FAIR. Jean-Paul, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Saijal.
So this is welcome news. Can you just explain sort of what's in place now or what's been in place before and what changes?
Sure. So currently the system is that on the banking side, the banks effectively have been able to choose their own referee. So there's two external ombud services, OBSI, which is the first one you mentioned, and another one called ADRBO. And many of the big banks in Canada have been switched. They used to be with OBSI, and they decided to switch over to the other organization. And the two organizations are quite different. ADRBO, for example, is a for-profit organization, and OBSI is a non-profit organization. And so this change is going to require all the banks to use the same external ombud service to resolve their customer complaints.
And sort of, and independent, my understanding.
Yes. So OBSI, as I said, is nonprofit. So it doesn't have any for-profit motives here. There's no issue of a perception that it's going to make recommendations in favor of the banks because it's the banks that are paying their expenses and making them more profitable. It's independent. It's arm's length. It provides a free service to Canadians, and it's been doing this for more than 25 years, and it has a very good track record in helping both banks and their customers resolve complaints.
Jean-Paul, something you pointed out in a comment I read too that I thought was interesting is the way Canada has been handling this or dealing with all of this has actually fallen behind international standards. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So some of the measures introduced by the federal government are going to bring us more in line with those standards. So most other countries, and I'm thinking particularly countries similar to Canada, like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and others, they actually have created an ombud service through legislation and have given the ombud service real powers to help resolve consumer complaints. We still do not have a legislative ombud service in Canada, but we're still able to do a pretty good job in terms of resolving complaints. Some of the areas, though, where we fall short of international standards is, for example, we still allow the financial institutions to take up to 90 days if they're investment dealers, and 56 days for the banks to try to resolve the complaints directly with their clients, and if they're not, then they can use the OBSI services. So that's one area where we're hoping to close the gap. Other countries, for example, require the financial institutions to resolve or try to resolve the complaints directly with their consumers or clients within 45 days.
Okay.
Another very big area of difference is that in these other countries, when the ombudsman makes a recommendation in terms of how to resolve the complaint, that recommendation must be followed by the financial institution. And we do not have that in Canada. So the banks and the investment dealers are free to walk away if they're not happy with the recommendation that OBSI makes.
Okay, well, that's really interesting then. So they don't actually have to follow what the OBSI says or, the conclusion it makes?
There's no mandatory requirement for them to do so. Now, it's important to add that on the banking side, there has never been a refusal by a Canadian bank to follow OBSI's recommendations. Most of the issues are in relation to complaints against investment dealers.
Okay.
And there are outright refusals. So it's very unfair to the consumer that goes through this whole process, which can take many months to navigate. And then at the end of the process, the dealer decides to just walk away.
Welcome back. Jean-Paul, before the break, you were talking about um, complaints and resolving complaints, and you were saying that technically investment firms and banks can walk away, and you were talking about the investment side. Can you continue?
Yeah, so there's really two issues, and it really does pertain to investment dealers that are members of OBSI. So, as I was saying, they are not required to follow the recommendations after OBSI concludes its investigation, and so that's a real problem for consumers, and it's quite unfair to them. Now, we haven't had an investment dealer refuse a recommendation, I think, for the past 2 years, which is good news. But we did have a flurry of refusals in prior years, again, which is a very unfair outcome for consumers. The other problem, though, and again, we see this mostly on the investment side, is where the dealers engage in a lowball settlement kind of tactic.
Yeah.
And they say, listen, OBSI has recommended, let's say $40,000 as fair compensation for the complaint, to resolve the complaint. We don't have to follow that, but we're willing to settle it with you, but at a lower amount. And some of the numbers are quite startling when you think about it. So there was an independent assessment done of OBSI, and the independent assessor looked at a 5-year period. And in that 5-year period, she estimated that investors were paid about $3 million less than what OBSI had recommended in terms of settling the complaint in a fair manner.
So, Jean-Paul, for those who are watching this, then what do they do? I mean, I'm sure they don't want to take the first offer that comes along.
Well, they're in a tight spot, and we have to remember that when you're dealing with a complaint, especially on the investment side, and you may have lost a significant amount of money, you're in a particularly vulnerable position. And so we are advocating, and we're hoping that the Canadian securities regulators will be introducing a mechanism to actually make OBSI decisions binding on the firms that are members of that organization.
Okay. Jean-Paul, I know just over the past year, there have been, more measures sort of put in place to try to resolve these complaints as a whole. I'm just wondering, have you seen evidence that it's actually helping to improve customer service? One, and two, whether consumers are aware that this is an option.
So in terms of your first question, so yes, in a strange way, OBSI is receiving more complaints on the banking side than they have before. And one of the reasons is because the federal government also shortened the amount of time banks have to respond to consumer complaints. And what they did that because the concern was that people would eventually just give up and not proceed with their complaint because it was just taking too much time. So the federal government introduced a 56-day time period for banks to try to resolve their complaints before the consumer can bring their complaint to OBSI and hope that OBSI can help them resolve. So that's actually been a beneficial, and it's lowered the rate of attrition in terms of, so that is a positive thing. Mm-hmm. In terms of your second, sorry, what was your second question?
Yeah, the second question was just whether you have an indication of whether consumers and investors are even aware that this is an option. We have 30 seconds.
Yeah, unfortunately, most people don't pay too much attention to making a complaint until they have to make a complaint. There are requirements, though, on banks and dealers to provide information about the complaint handling process at the time you make a complaint. So we would encourage those that do bring a complaint to pay attention, read the materials. They're written in a way to really help people navigate the system.
Okay. Always appreciate your time, Jean Paul. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Saijal.
Jean Paul
Bye-bye.
Perrault of FAIR. Well, that wraps up this edition of Strictly Money. Don't forget, you can catch previous episodes of the show on the newsforum.ca. And also, if you have any questions, drop us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. Stay well, stay wise, and stay wealthy.